Your story matters, don't let it fade. When everything changed, you were made.
When everything changed, I pointed my face to the sun, I took a deep breath, and I realized that everything smelled different. In order for that to make sense, I've got to take you back in history, about 5 decades. So I'm originally from a small town outside of Seattle, Washington. Um, my parents were divorced in 1974, and at that time, um, things were real crazy in our lives. We saw a lot of violence, a lot of stuff happen, and my parents would fight, and my mom would throw things out the window. So in 1974, she packed up a Honda CVCC. If you remember those, they're the little tiny cars, and she drove away. And I didn't see her for several years. In 1975, my father got remarried, and he had 3 kids, my brother, my sister, and myself, and I'm the oldest. And he married somebody with a child. And so that was 4 of us. And he worked at night, and my stepmother worked during the day. And she wasn't prepared for that. She was not prepared to take care of 4 kids at 26 years old, primarily by herself. She got us up in the morning. She got us ready for school. We got home. She picked us up from the babysitter. She brought us home and she took care of us. And my father was never around. So that that absence of having a father around was really tough, particularly for my brother and I. And then along came 2 more children. So I'm the oldest of 6 kids now. And without my father around, there was a lot of abuse, and the cops and the sheriff would come and take us out of the house. We had child protective services in the house on a regular basis. We were taken out by the county sheriffs many times. And so I grew up without a father figure. I grew up without guidance, and I grew up not going to school, uh, getting into trouble. While I was in high school, I would get in trouble and get in fights and commit petty crimes. And I spent several days and weekends and weeks in juvenile hall as I continued to get in trouble as I grew up as a young man. And things came out as violence, and we would fight. And my friends and I, we would go look for fights. Well, I needed to get away from there. So in 1987, I joined the Washington State Army National Guard, and I left for basic training. And that was a pretty good opportunity. It got me away from the house, and there was structure. But I had to come home. I had to come home and finish high school. And so I went to basic training before my senior year, came home and barely graduated with a 1.8 GPA. And the only reason I graduated is I got work credit for being in the Army National Guard. And so I graduated from high school. I went to advanced training. Well, now I got to come back home. So I came home and I met up with the same people doing the same things that I was doing before. And I kept getting in trouble. And finally, I was arrested for burglary. And I was arrested for burglary, and I was sentenced to the county jail to 120 days in the county jail. And so I spent 120 days in the county jail, and that was a pretty traumatic experience. But it wasn't enough for me to change my life. So I continued getting in trouble even while I was in the county jail. Well, they let me out of the county jail, and that was in the summer of 1990. And just a few days after I got out of jail, my sister died. It was my best friend. And so for me, that was a big struggle. But it wasn't enough for me to change. So on the day she died, my father, who wasn't around, showed up at the hospital, and I was the only one there to tell him that my sister, his oldest daughter, was no longer with us. That wasn't enough to make me change. 5 days later, we buried my sister. And on that same day, I was arrested by the FBI at her funeral for bank robbery. Now, that wasn't enough to make me change. But that arrest, when the FBI showed up, grabbed me by the arms at that funeral, marched me to a car, and put me in the car with 2 FBI agents and took me to the county, or to the federal FBI office in downtown Seattle. And I admitted to it. And so in February of 1991, I was sentenced to 78 months and 3 years of probation for the committing the bank robberies. And they sent me to a correctional institution in a small town in Oregon called the Federal Correctional Institution of Sheridan, Oregon. And that wasn't a really bad place as far as prisons go. It was set up a lot like a college campus, and it was very organized, and it was, we had a lot of freedom, relatively speaking. However, that wasn't enough to make me change and not be a violent individual and not have the problems that I had. I was still bucking the system. And even though I had my first cellmate was a guy named Gary Walter Dash, who was about twice my age. He was in his 40s and I was 21 years old. And Doc, we called him. And Doc tried to keep me out of trouble. But even that guidance was not enough to make me change. So, being a violent individual, I got into a altercation with somebody. And when the correctional officers took me to segregation, I sat there for 2 days wondering if the other person would live. I almost killed another human being. Not enough to make me change. So, of course, they can't have me in a medium security anymore, right? So they pack me up and they send me to the United States Penitentiary in Lompoc, California. And at the time, there were only 5 maximum security penitentiaries in the United States. And they sent me to the worst one of them. On my very first day, I watched a human being lose his life. I was 22. In that time that I was there, I saw 3 people lose their lives, and I lived through 2 prison riots. That's a traumatic experience that's left me with PTSD. And until recently, I didn't start sleeping at night. That was a really hard thing to get over. But there were people there who were trying to help me change. One of the deadliest Hell's Angels in the world, a guy named Otis Buck Garrett, took me under his wing. And every day we would walk around the track and we would talk about what we're going to do and what I was going to do when I was going to get out because he wasn't going anywhere. We would talk about that. And one day he stopped and he looked me right in the face and he said, "What are you going to do when you get out?" And without hesitation, I said, "I'm going to get a gun and a bag. What the fuck do you think I'm going to do? I'm going to fill it full of money." See, I still hadn't changed. So living through prison and spending about 20% of that 6.5 years in solitary confinement left me with a lot of trauma, but it also left me with a lot of time to think. And so on August 16th, 1996, I got out. My brother came down to pick me up. Man, we had fun. We drove back to Seattle. He picked me up in his Jeep and we drove back to Seattle. And every time there was a river in Northern California, we pulled over and we stripped down to our underwear and we went swimming. And we were having a great time. Well, I got home and I'll tell you what, August 16th, 1996 was the scariest day of my entire life. I could live in prison. I can live that life. It's organized. I understand what the rules are. But getting out and coming over here was very difficult to do because there's a lot of consequences if you don't change. So the next day, my mother's partner, Thyra, drove me downtown Seattle and I got out of the car. I was as scared as I've ever been. I had to go meet a probation officer. Well, I was still under the impression I'm just going to beat this paper. I'm going to get off probation and I'm going to go do whatever I want to do. So I did pretty good for a couple of years. I went to work. I had some jobs and things were going pretty well until I did get off probation I figured out where the methamphetamines were at. And I spent several years strung out on methamphetamines. I lived in people's closets. I lived in a box van. I would stay in people's sheds if that's all they could offer me. And so for several years, that was my life. In fact, it got so bad that one day I did a shot of methamphetamines and I thought I was going to die. And in that instant, I thought so quickly, no, that's not true. I know now how much I can do without dying. 2 days later, I did another shot of methamphetamines and I was positive I was going to die. Well, that was in September of 2001. On September 29th, 2001, my brother and I went to go get a truck that I pawned so that I could get high. And on the way back, sitting in the passenger seat, he said to me, "Can you do me a favor? It won't cost you a dime. Just quit getting high." It was 23 years ago. I haven't been high since. I've been out of prison for 28 years. I don't abuse kids. The odds of overcoming a methamphetamine addiction, recidivism, and abuse, the probability of me being successful was about 0.02%, less than a percent. People just don't overcome one, let alone all three of those. So then I got clean. I needed some space from that family and the bad situations. So I packed my shit up and I moved to Wisconsin, away from all of my family and all of my friends and every single trigger that I had, because I needed to change. I needed something different. And I moved out here and I got a job in construction. And in 2007, when the market crashed, you couldn't find a job in construction. I couldn't find a job sweeping a floor. So I sold a boat, a truck, a Harley Davidson, and 2 ATVs, and I went to college. I got a degree from the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater. I graduated with honors. In 2011, at 41 years old, I'm now a college graduate with a job. And 8 years later, I received my first executive position. I was promoted to vice president of supply chain for a $1 billion company. Now, that's a lot to digest. And there's a lot of things that did make me change. And there were a lot of people in there that made me change. So one of the things that I want to share with, not just share my story, but the things that I did to be able to change. The first thing was I had to find a way to love myself. And a lot of times that's not a question we ask ourselves. So I encourage everybody, when you get up in the morning, ask yourself, do you love you? Because you can't love another human being unless you can love yourself. The second thing I had to do was learn to forgive myself. That was hard. That was tough. I don't think I've done anything that hard. To forgive myself for getting arrested at my sister's funeral, forgive myself for the trauma that I caused my stepmother, to forgive myself for all of the pain and suffering I put my brothers and sisters through. I had to learn to forgive myself. The third thing I had to do was I had to get healthy. Okay, so I quit doing drugs, start eating right, start exercising a little bit, take care of your body, but also to take care of your mind. Now, got into professional therapy. It's good to have somebody to talk to, but the biggest gains I've ever made were by getting myself into some therapy and finding it okay to share. It took me 30 years to be able to share my story out loud. So, became a vice president of supply chain, but I retired in February of this year. I'm 55 years old, and I retired. And I did that because I want to spend the rest of the useful years I have left helping other people who are going through similar situations to be able to get through those situations and not just not go back to prison, to not do more drugs, not abuse their children, but to thrive in society, because I've had that opportunity. So I had to learn to love myself. I had to learn to forgive myself. I had to learn to take care of myself. I had to learn to recognize, the last thing I had to do was recognize where all the people who have helped me, we talk about when. When my brother asked me to quit doing drugs. When Otis Buck Garrett smacked me on the back of the head and said, "What are you going to do when you get out of prison?" When that probation officer had me sitting there every single week peeing in a little bottle. The mother that took me in and helped me out. The people that have encouraged me. The chief human resources officer that saw something in me to create a plan from sourcing manager to vice president. But I'll tell you, it was on August 16th, 1996, when I walked through the prison gate. I hugged my brother. I turned my face to the sun and I took a deep breath. And I realized it fucking smells different out here. That's when everything changed. Thank you.
Your story matters, don't let it fade. When everything changed, you were made.